You're in the middle of a conversation. Someone is talking. You're nodding. And somewhere behind your eyes, completely hidden even from yourself, you have no idea what you actually feel. Not vaguely unsure. Completely blank. You've been having this experience your entire life. You just haven't noticed it because there's always something to do next. A response to give. A face to make. A role to step back into. The feeling, whatever it was, gets filed somewhere unnamed, and you move on. Here's the thing. That's not emotional immaturity. That's not weakness. That's what happens when nobody ever taught you that your inner life was worth paying attention to. You learned math. You learned to drive. You learned to read a room socially. But you never learned to read yourself. So you improvise. Every day. With incomplete information. And you wonder why certain decisions keep backfiring. Why certain relationships keep producing the same friction. Why you can achieve things on the outside while something on the inside stays perpetually unsettled. I spent years believing I was self-aware because I could talk about my feelings. Turns out, narrating your emotions and actually understanding them are two completely different skills. What this book is about is the second one. Not emotional vocabulary, not sensitivity, not the ability to cry at the right moments or stay calm in meetings. We're talking about something more structural. The ability to see your own emotional patterns clearly enough to stop being run by them. That's a different project. It's harder. It's slower. And it changes everything it touches. Look, you don't need more motivation. You don't need to be told that emotions matter. You already know something is operating underneath your decisions that you can't fully see. This book is about learning to see it. That's the only promise being made here. Before we begin, if you're done waiting for motivation to find you, hit like. Not for me, for you. And subscribe only if you're serious about building the version you keep talking about. Chapter 1. The feeling you can't name. You feel terrible. You know you feel terrible. And that's the end of your self-knowledge. Most people stop there. They register the presence of a feeling, slap a general label on it, stressed, upset, off, and then try to push through or push it down. What they don't realize is that stopping there is like a doctor diagnosing every patient with something's wrong. Technically accurate. Completely useless. Here's what's actually happening inside you at any given moment. Not one emotion, not two. A layered, overlapping, sometimes contradictory cluster of distinct states, each carrying different information, each pointing toward different needs, and you're compressing all of it into a single blunt word. Then you're making decisions based on that word. Then you're wondering why the decisions don't land right. Psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett spent decades researching this. What she found was that people who can distinguish between more emotional states, not just feel more, but name more precisely, make better decisions, recover from setbacks faster, and are less likely to act in ways they later regret. She called it emotional granularity. The grain of your emotional perception determines the quality of your emotional response. Think about what that means practically. You snap at someone you love. You call it stress. But if you sat with it, really sat with it, you might find it's not stress. It's something closer to helplessness, a specific kind too. The helplessness of someone who's been competent their whole life suddenly feeling like they can't get traction. That's a completely different signal. Stress says slow down. Helplessness says something specific isn't working and you need to find out what. Same feeling on the surface, completely different information underneath. The average person operates with roughly a dozen emotional labels: happy, sad, angry, anxious, fine. These aren't emotions. They're emotional zip codes. They tell you the general region. They don't tell you the street, the house, or what's inside it. Consider the difference between irritation, indignation, and contempt. All three feel like anger adjacent. All three show up with a similar heat. But irritation is usually about inconvenience. It fades when the situation changes. Indignation is about violated values. It doesn't fade until something is acknowledged or addressed. Contempt is about a loss of respect. And once it appears in a relationship, research suggests it's one of the strongest predictors of that relationship ending. If you can't tell these three apart, you'll treat them all the same way. You'll try to wait out contempt like it's irritation. It won't work, and you won't know why. Let me back up. The problem isn't just vocabulary. Vocabulary is the tool. The underlying issue is that most people have never been given permission to take their emotional experience seriously enough to examine it. Feelings were something to manage, express appropriately, or get over. Not something to study. Not something that contained information worth understanding. So the examination muscle never developed. You got the emotion. You reacted to it. You moved on. And the pattern repeated. Building emotional granularity starts with slowing down at the moment of feeling and asking a more precise question. Not, how do I feel? That question is too open. It sends you back to the zip code. Instead, what specifically is happening inside me right now? Is this about the present moment, or something it's reminding me of? Is this in my chest, my jaw, my stomach? Is it moving, or is it stuck? Does it want something from me, or is it just asking to be acknowledged? These aren't therapy questions. They're diagnostic ones. You're gathering data. You're increasing the resolution on an image that's been blurry your entire life. There's a moment most people have experienced and never examined. You're in a conversation, something is said, and a feeling moves through you so fast you almost miss it. A flash of something, hurt maybe, or shame, or sudden loneliness, and then it's gone, buried under your next sentence. That flash was real. It had information, and it got filed under nothing because you didn't have the tools to catch it. Those flashes accumulate. They don't disappear. They compound, and 6 months later, you don't know why you feel vaguely hollow around someone you're supposed to love. I want to give you one concrete practice. For the next week, when you notice any emotional shift, not the big ones, the small ones, pause for 30 seconds and try to name it with more specificity than usual. Not sad. Specifically, what kind of sad? The kind that comes from feeling invisible? The kind that comes from remembering something you can't have back? The kind that's actually disappointment in yourself wearing a sadder coat? You don't need to be right. You need to practice looking. The difference between someone with high emotional granularity and someone without it isn't that one person feels more deeply. It's that one person can see what they're feeling clearly enough to respond to it accurately. The other person is driving with a fogged windshield, making constant micro-corrections they can't quite explain, wondering why the ride feels so unstable. Here's the uncomfortable part. Most people prefer the fog. Seeing clearly means seeing things you'd rather not see. It means noticing when you're not angry, but actually scared. When you're not fine, but actually grieving. When what you've been calling ambition has a significant amount of dread underneath it. the fog is more comfortable, and it costs you everything. What you name, you can work with. What you can't name runs you from the inside, invisible and unopposed, calling every shot while you believe you're the one deciding. That's where we start. Chapter 2. The Editor in Your Skull. Your brain is not showing you yourself. It's showing you a version of yourself it believes you can handle. Everything you think you know about who you are, your personality, your reactions, your memories, your sense of what you're capable of, has been processed, filtered, and selectively presented by the same organ you're trying to use to examine it. That's not a metaphor. That's the architecture. The brain didn't evolve to give you accurate self-knowledge. It evolved to keep you alive and socially connected. Those goals overlap with accurate self-knowledge sometimes, and sometimes they directly contradict it. When they contradict it, the brain doesn't choose truth. It chooses function. It chooses whatever version of reality keeps you moving, keeps you protected, and keeps you acceptable within your social group. You've been living inside that edited version your whole life, and because you've never seen the unedited cut, you assume what you're seeing is the full picture. Consider the negativity bias. You send a project to 6 people. 5 respond with genuine enthusiasm. 1 sends back 3 sentences of criticism. That evening, you replay the 3 sentences. The 5 responses barely register. You're not neurotic. You're not insecure. Well, maybe, but that's not why this is happening. Your brain is running an ancient threat detection program that treats negative information as more urgent than positive information. In an ancestral environment, ignoring a threat could kill you. Ignoring a compliment just meant you missed something nice. The asymmetry was logical. In your current life, it means you systematically distort your picture of reality toward the negative without realizing you're doing it. Here's what this does to self-perception over time. You accumulate a portrait of yourself that's built disproportionately from your failures, your embarrassments, your worst moments. Your successes get attributed to luck or circumstances. Your failures get attributed to you permanently. And you call this portrait honest self-awareness. It isn't. It's a biased sample masquerading as the truth. The confirmation bias layers on top of that. Your brain is not a neutral observer of your experience. It's a hypothesis tester that already has its conclusions and is looking for evidence to support them. If you carry a belief that you're not someone people truly respect, your brain will notice every ambiguous social cue that could be interpreted as dismissal. It will barely register the moments of genuine admiration. Not because those moments don't exist, because they don't fit the hypothesis. You think you're perceiving reality. You're actually perceiving your predictions about reality, occasionally updated by data that's been pre-screened for compatibility. Now add something most people have never heard of: implicit emotional memory. Your brain stores certain emotional experiences not as narrative memories, not as stories you can recall and examine, but as physical and emotional patterns that get activated by triggers you often can't consciously identify. A particular tone of voice, the specific way someone pauses before they speak, the quality of light in a room at a certain time of day. These triggers fire the old emotional state directly, without narration, without warning, without any obvious connection to the present moment. You walk into a meeting and feel a low-grade dread you can't explain. You're on a first date that's going well and suddenly you feel a need to leave. You're praised by someone in authority and feel, strangely, more anxious instead of more confident. None of these responses are about now. They're emotional echoes from then, playing at full volume in a completely different room. Look, this is the part people resist most. Because if your emotional responses are frequently not about what's actually happening, then the story you've been telling yourself about your life needs serious revision. And revision is uncomfortable. It's much easier to believe your anxiety about the meeting is rational. Your need to leave the date is intuition. Your anxiety after praise is just humility. Maybe. Or maybe you're running 30-year-old software in a situation that has nothing to do with what originally wrote it. The default mode network is the brain system that activates when you're not focused on a task. It's responsible for self-referential thought. When your mind wanders, this is where it goes. And research consistently shows it has a negative default setting. Left alone, it drifts toward regret, worry, and self-criticism. This isn't your personality. This is your hardware, the voice in your head that quietly narrates your failures when you're in the shower. That's not an honest narrator. It's an anxious one, built for a world that no longer exists, running commentary on a life it doesn't fully understand. None of this makes you a victim of your brain. It makes you someone who needs to understand the instrument before trusting its readings. You are not your thoughts about yourself. You are not the pattern your brain defaults to when it's unguarded. The real work, is learning to see which parts of your self-perception are signal and which parts are static. That requires slowing down, questioning your automatic conclusions, and developing a genuinely curious relationship with your own blind spots. Which is harder than it sounds, because some of those blind spots have been protecting you for a very long time. Chapter 3. Where the feeling actually comes from you snap at someone. You know it was too much. You feel the wrongness of it even as it's happening. And then you tell yourself you're just stressed, and you move on. But something nags, because the reaction didn't match the moment. The volume was wrong, and somewhere underneath, you know it. That mismatch between the intensity of your reaction and the actual weight of the situation is one of the most important signals your emotional life produces. And most people spend their lives ignoring it. Here's the principle. Your current emotional response is almost never only about what's currently happening. It's a mixture. Present signal plus past amplification plus physical state plus the cumulative weight of everything you haven't fully processed yet. What you experience as one clean emotion is usually a cocktail. And if you treat it as though it's only about now, you'll keep responding to the wrong thing. Call this emotional sourcing. The ability to trace a feeling back to its actual origin rather than accepting the most obvious explanation. A woman, composite of patterns I've seen described consistently in psychological literature, sits across from her manager in a routine performance review. The feedback is mild, constructive, genuinely well-intentioned. Her manager says she sometimes waits too long to ask for help. Objectively minor observation. She walks out of the room with her hands shaking. By the time she reaches her car, she's in tears, and she doesn't fully understand why. The feedback wasn't the trigger. The feedback opened a door that led somewhere else. To every moment in her childhood where needing help was treated as weakness. To a parent who responded to requests for support with impatience or silence. The manager's words landed in that old room, and the response belonged there, not here. This happens constantly. in ways less dramatic and just as distorting. Your partner doesn't text back for 3 hours and you feel a cold, sinking dread that is completely disproportionate to 3 hours of silence. Your colleague gets credit for something you contributed to, and the anger that rises feels almost violent in its intensity. Someone cancels plans, and you feel not just disappointed, but somehow confirmed. Confirmed in some old belief about your own dispensability. The intensity is the tell. When the emotional volume is significantly higher than the situation seems to warrant, something older is being activated. Emotional sourcing doesn't mean excavating your entire childhood every time you feel something. That's not practical, and it's not the point. The practice is simpler. When you notice a strong reaction, you ask, is this response sized correctly for what actually just happened? If the answer is no, and you'll know, because part of you always knows, you follow it a little further. What does this remind me of? What does this situation feel like? Where have I felt this specific flavor of feeling before? You're not looking for a complete psychological history. You're looking for the seam, the place where now and then are stitched together. Finding the seam doesn't dissolve the feeling, but it stops the feeling from masquerading as objective information about the present. There's another dimension to this that almost nobody accounts for. Your physical state is constantly altering your emotional state. Not metaphorically, chemically. Sleep deprivation doesn't just make you tired. It measurably reduces activity in your prefrontal cortex and amplifies reactivity in your amygdala. You become, neurologically, a slightly different person. More threat-sensitive, less able to contextualize, more likely to interpret ambiguous situations as hostile. Hunger does the same thing. So does chronic low-grade dehydration. So does the particular hormonal fluctuation that happens in the hour after intense stress, when cortisol is still elevated but the stressor is gone. You're trying to read your emotional life with an instrument that's constantly being affected by variables you're not tracking. And then you're making meaning from the readings as though they're stable. Actually, let me say this differently. The point isn't that your emotions aren't real. They're completely real. The point is that their cause is almost always more complex than it appears. And accepting the most obvious cause without questioning it is how you end up in the same emotional loops for decades. People who master emotional sourcing develop a particular habit. Before they respond to a strong emotion, they run a quick internal audit. Am I rested? Have I eaten? Is there something unresolved from earlier today that I haven't processed? Is this situation genuinely threatening, or does it just pattern match to something that once was? This audit takes 30 seconds. It doesn't eliminate the emotion, but it contextualizes it. And context is the difference between reacting and responding. The goal isn't emotional detachment. It's emotional accuracy. You want to know what's actually driving you, not the surface story, the actual one. Because once you can see that clearly, you stop being ambushed by your own reactions. You stop apologizing for things that weren't really about what you said they were about. You stop carrying the weight of accumulated unprocessed emotion as though it's just your personality. Some of what you've been calling who I am is just what you've never looked at closely enough. Chapter 4. The map you never drew. You've been to this place before. Different road, same destination. Different person, same fight. Different job, same particular brand of misery at month 4. You arrive somewhere emotionally and think, I've been here. You have. You just don't have a map that shows you how you keep getting back. Your emotional life is not random. That's the thing people miss. It feels random because it's largely unconscious. But unconscious is not the same as chaotic. Your emotional reactions follow patterns, precise, consistent, predictable ones. The same triggers activate the same responses, activate the same behaviors. Every time. On schedule. Like clockwork that you can't see because you're inside it. Drawing your emotional map means making the invisible visible. It means studying your own patterns with the same rigor you'd apply to anything else worth understanding. Start with what researchers call your emotional baseline. The default emotional state you operate in when nothing particularly good or bad is happening. For some people, it's a mild, ambient anxiety. For others, it's a low-level restlessness. For others, it's a kind of flatness that's comfortable but numbing. This baseline isn't neutral. It colors everything. It's the emotional water you swim in so constantly you've stopped noticing it's wet. Identifying your baseline requires the kind of observation that most people never practice. Not during the dramatic moments, during the ordinary ones, the Tuesday afternoons, the moments between tasks. What's underneath when nothing particular is happening? What's the emotional hum that runs beneath your daily life? That hum is the foundation of your map. Everything else gets built on top of it. From the baseline, you can start tracing your trigger architecture. Triggers aren't just the obvious ones, the things that make you visibly angry or suddenly anxious. Triggers are any stimuli that reliably shift your emotional state. They can move you up, down, or sideways, and they cluster. Here's what most people miss about their triggers. They're not random sensitivities. They're guards posted at your deepest needs and fears. Every trigger is protecting something. Find what it's protecting, and you've found something essential about yourself. If you're consistently triggered by situations where you're not consulted on decisions that affect you, that's not just a preference for communication. That's a deep need for autonomy. Maybe respect. Maybe both. If you're consistently triggered by people who seem not to need you, who are fine, perfectly fine, without your help, that's pointing somewhere specific too. Probably toward a need to feel essential, to matter in a concrete, functional way. The trigger is the symptom. The need underneath is the diagnosis. Mapping your triggers means asking, for every consistent emotional reaction, what would have to be true for this to make sense? Not, why am I like this? That question leads to shame spirals. But, given that I keep reacting this way, what need or fear is so alive in me that this situation keeps setting it off? You answer that question honestly, and you found something on your map that was previously invisible. The next layer is your emotional response patterns. The sequences your emotional reactions follow after being triggered. Because triggers don't just produce feelings, they produce sequences. A pattern of feelings, thoughts, and behaviors that unfold in a predictable order. For one person, the sequence is feel criticized, feel ashamed, go silent, feel resentful about going silent, push the resentment down, feel fine, apparently, same dynamic, 2 weeks later. For another, feel overlooked, leads to feel angry, leads to express the anger too forcefully, leads to feel guilty about the expression, leads to over-apologize, leads to feel diminished by the over-apology, leads to feel resentful, leads to feel overlooked. You see how they loop. You see how each step in the sequence creates the conditions for the next one, and how the loop can run for years, for decades, without the person ever seeing the full sequence because they're always inside it. I've run sequences I didn't even know I had. Recognizing the pattern, really seeing it written out, was the first moment I stopped feeling like it was happening to me. Mapping your sequences requires tracking them in real time, which is initially difficult because by the time you notice you're in a sequence, you're usually halfway through it. Start by tracking it backward. After a difficult emotional experience, reconstruct the sequence. What did I feel first? What thought followed? What did I do? What did I feel about what I did? Where did it end up? Do this enough times and the pattern becomes visible. And once it's visible, you have choice. Not immediately, not automatically, but eventually. The emotional map also includes your resource landscape, the specific conditions that support your emotional stability and the specific conditions that deplete it. This isn't about preferences, it's about honest data. Some people discover they can handle almost any emotional challenge if they've slept. The same challenge after 3 nights of poor sleep sends them into reactive patterns they can't control. Some people need solitude to process emotion. Without it, feelings accumulate unprocessed and eventually burst out sideways in situations that don't warrant them. Knowing this about yourself isn't self-indulgence. It's operational intelligence. You wouldn't try to run a marathon without knowing how your body responds to different conditions. Running your emotional life without knowing your resource landscape is exactly that. The map is never finished. You are not a static system. As you change, as your circumstances change, as your relationships change, your emotional patterns shift. Old triggers soften, new ones emerge. Needs that were buried become legible. The map has to stay current. But here's what having any map does, that having no map doesn't. It gives you the experience of recognizing where you are. Even when you're in a difficult emotional place, especially then, there's a specific and significant difference between being lost and knowing exactly where you are on the terrain. One of those feels like drowning. The other just feels like somewhere hard you know how to move through. Chapter 5. The Mirror Problem. The people who talk most fluently about self-awareness are often the least self-aware people in the room. That's not cynicism. That's a pattern with a specific psychological explanation. And if you've ever sat across from someone who could narrate their childhood wounds with impressive precision while doing the exact thing those wounds produce, right in front of you without noticing, you've witnessed it firsthand. Here's what's happening. Self-awareness has 2 versions. There's the performed version, where you've learned the language of introspection, accumulated a working theory about yourself, and can describe your patterns articulately. And there's the functional version, where you actually catch yourself in the pattern while it's happening and have real capacity to do something different. These 2 versions can exist completely independently of each other. And most people who believe they have the second one actually only have the first. The performed version feels like self-awareness. It produces the sensation of knowing yourself. It allows you to say things like, "I know I tend to shut down when I feel criticized," in a tone that implies you've solved it. What it doesn't do is stop you from shutting down when you feel criticized. The gap between those 2 things, between articulating your pattern and actually interrupting it, is where most self-development work quietly fails. Why does this happen? Because genuine self-awareness is uncomfortable in a way that performed self-awareness isn't. Performed self-awareness lets you observe yourself from a safe distance. You're describing a character you've named and categorized. Functional self-awareness puts you in direct contact with something you'd rather not see, in real time, with no distance. It's the difference between reading about cold water and being in it. Your brain has an elaborate system for making sure you stay in the reading about it stage. Psychologists call these defense mechanisms, but that name makes them sound more deliberate than they are. They're automatic. They operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, and their primary function is to protect your existing self-concept from information that would force you to revise it. Here's what that looks like in practice. You believe you're a generous person. Someone points out an instance where you were withholding. Your brain doesn't register this as useful information. It registers it as a threat. And within seconds, without your conscious participation, it has generated a counter-narrative. The person who pointed it out is oversensitive. The situation was exceptional. You were stressed. Your generosity in other contexts outweighs this one moment. By the time you've finished the thought, the threat has been neutralized, and your self-concept is intact. You didn't lie to yourself. You didn't even decide anything. The protection was automatic, and it felt completely rational from the inside. This is the mirror problem. The mirror you're using to see yourself is not a neutral, reflective surface. It's a mirror that's been specially treated to show you a version of yourself your ego can tolerate. It softens certain angles. It sharpens others. And you've been looking at it for so long, you've forgotten it isn't showing you everything. Look, the hardest part of this to accept is that the distortion isn't random. It's specifically designed to protect the beliefs about yourself that feel most essential to your identity. The more central a belief is to your sense of self, the more aggressively the defense mechanisms protect it. Which means the areas where you have the most distortion are precisely the areas that feel most certain. The thing you are most sure about yourself is probably where you should look first. There's a clinical concept that maps onto this perfectly. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the collection of traits, impulses, and capacities that you've disowned or denied because they conflict with your self-image or were unacceptable in the environment where you grew up. The shadow isn't just the dark stuff. It's also capabilities you were taught to suppress, needs you learned to be ashamed of, emotions you were told weren't appropriate for someone like you. The shadow doesn't disappear when you deny it. It goes underground, and from underground, it still runs your behavior, just without your knowledge or consent. You see it in the person who prides themselves on emotional control and occasionally erupts in ways that shock even them. In the high achiever who sabotages themselves at the final moment with a consistency that looks almost intentional. In the endlessly giving caretaker who occasionally and inexplicably withdraws all warmth without warning. Those aren't glitches. Those are the shadow operating on schedule. Genuine self-awareness, the functional kind, requires what Jung called shadow integration. Not excavating every dark corner simultaneously, not performing a psychological audit, something simpler and more ongoing. Developing the habit of getting curious when you react strongly, judge harshly, or feel the particular discomfort of recognizing something in someone else that you find intolerable. Because what you find intolerable in others is frequently, not always, but frequently, something you haven't made peace with in yourself. The person whose arrogance makes you viscerally angry, the colleague whose neediness you find exhausting, the friend's particular brand of self-pity that makes you want to leave the room. Worth asking, quietly and without self-judgment, where does this live in me? Not in the same form necessarily, but in some form. That question is uncomfortable. That's exactly why it works. There's another layer to the mirror problem that operates differently. Some people are extraordinarily self-critical. They seem to have no self-protective mechanism at all. They absorb every criticism, magnify every flaw, and maintain a portrait of themselves that's relentlessly negative. This can look like radical self-honesty. It usually isn't. It's a different kind of distortion. The self-critical portrait is as selective and as defended as the self-flattering one. It focuses obsessively on certain failures while ignoring genuine capabilities. It protects a different belief, that you are fundamentally inadequate, with the same automatic ferocity that defensive protection maintains beliefs of superiority. Both are mirrors that have been treated. Both show you something real and something distorted simultaneously. Real self-awareness doesn't look like either of those. It's quieter, more tentative. It holds its conclusions loosely. It can sit with, "I don't fully know why I did that," without immediately reaching for an explanation. It gets interested in its own blind spots rather than threatened by them. It can receive feedback, positive or negative, and consider it without immediately filing it as confirmation or threat. It feels, when you encounter it in someone else, like a particular kind of steadiness. Not certainty. Steadiness. The steadiness of someone who has looked at themselves honestly enough that they're no longer surprised by what they find. That steadiness is available to you. But not through more self-analysis, not through more accurate self-narration, through the specific practice of catching yourself in the pattern, not afterward, during. It starts small. You notice the defensiveness rising before you've fully expressed it. You catch the rationalization assembling itself before you've committed to it. You feel the withdrawal starting, and you name it to yourself before it's complete. These micro-catches don't stop the pattern immediately, but they create a sliver of daylight between you and the automatic response. And that sliver, widened over time, is where genuine choice begins to live. The mirror will always have some treatment on it. You're human. Complete objectivity about yourself isn't possible or even entirely desirable. But you can learn to hold the mirror at different angles. You can learn to check what you're seeing against other sources of data. Trusted people, behavioral patterns, outcomes that keep repeating. You can develop enough flexibility in your self-concept that new information doesn't feel like a threat to your survival. The goal isn't to finally see yourself perfectly. The goal is to become genuinely curious about what you're not seeing. That shift from defended to curious changes everything. Because a defended mind is a closed system. It recycles the same information and produces the same conclusions. A curious mind is open. It can actually learn. It can change. It can grow in directions it didn't predict. And it turns out that's the only kind of mind that can actually see itself. Chapter 6. What your body already knows. Your chest tightens in a meeting. Your breathing goes shallow before you've consciously registered anything is wrong. Your stomach drops in a conversation where everyone is still smiling. Your body knew first. It always does. This isn't mysticism. This is neurological sequencing. Your nervous system processes incoming information faster than your conscious mind can form a response. By the time you've thought something feels off here, your body has already run the assessment, flagged the threat, and begun preparing a response. The tightness, the shallowness, the drop. Those aren't reactions to your thoughts. They're ahead of your thoughts. They're the raw data before the story gets built around it. Most people have learned to ignore this data entirely. not through laziness, through conditioning. From early in life, the message arrives in various forms. Don't be so sensitive. You're overreacting. That's not a big deal. Toughen up. And gradually, you learn to override the signal. You develop a gap between what your body is registering and what you allow yourself to consciously acknowledge. You become, in a precise sense, partially deaf to your own nervous system. And then you wonder why you keep ending up in situations that somehow, in retrospect, you should have seen coming. The body keeps a different kind of record than the mind does. The mind edits. It contextualizes, rationalizes, revises. The body is more conservative. It responds to patterns. It remembers safety and threat not as narratives, but as physical states. When you walk into an environment that pattern matches to something historically unsafe, a specific social dynamic, a particular emotional tone in a room, even a quality of silence, your nervous system activates a response before your conscious mind has finished taking in the scene. This is the somatic early warning system. It's been running your entire life. Most people have never been formally introduced to it. Learning to read it starts with basic body mapping. Not during emotional crises. Your signal-to-noise ratio is too poor then. Start in ordinary moments. Sit quietly and run a slow scan from your feet upward. Notice where there's tension you didn't know was there. Your jaw, your shoulders, the small muscles around your eyes, the chronic tightening across your upper back that you've habituated to so completely it only registers as normal. That chronic tension is emotional information in storage. Not processed, not released, just held. Your body became the filing cabinet for everything your mind decided not to examine. There's a concept in somatic psychology called the window of tolerance. It describes the range of emotional intensity within which you can function, feeling things without being overwhelmed by them or shutting down from them. Inside the window, your nervous system is regulated. You can think, respond, connect. Outside the window, either flooded or frozen, those capacities drop dramatically. Here's the critical piece. Your window isn't fixed. It expands with practice. And the first step to expanding it is knowing where its edges are. Because most people only discover their window's edge when they've already gone through it, when they're already in the flood or the freeze, already saying the thing they'll regret, or already gone completely flat and unreachable. Learning to recognize the approach to the edge before you cross it is where genuine emotional regulation begins. And the recognition is almost always physical first. For flooding, when emotion is becoming overwhelming, the early signals are typically physiological. Heart rate climbing, breathing becoming chest-centered rather than belly-centered, muscle tension spiking, especially in the neck and jaw, a specific kind of narrowing in peripheral vision that happens when the threat response activates. Heat in the face or chest. These signals appear before the emotional experience fully peaks. They are your window of opportunity. For freezing, when emotion shuts you down, the signals are different. A heaviness that settles into the limbs, a slight dissociation, like watching yourself from a small distance, slowing of thought and speech, decreased sensation, a quality of waiting without knowing what you're waiting for. These signals are quieter and therefore easier to miss, but they're there. Learning your personal early warning signals is one of the highest leverage things you can do for your emotional intelligence, because it moves the intervention point from after the fact to before the fact. You stop spending your energy managing the aftermath of emotional reactions. You start preventing the hijack. I've walked out of situations I couldn't explain in the moment, just a strong physical pull toward the door, and found out later that my body had correctly assessed something my mind hadn't processed yet. The practice is this. For the next 2 weeks, every time you notice any physical shift, not just the dramatic ones, the small ones, treat it as information rather than noise. A slight tension in your throat when someone speaks. A relaxation in your shoulders when a conversation ends. A specific quality of tiredness that arrives not from exertion, but from social environments that cost you something. Start keeping a simple log. Physical sensation, situation, what I was feeling emotionally, if I can name it. After 2 weeks, look at the log. You will find patterns you didn't know existed. Physical states that reliably predict emotional states. Environments that reliably produce specific physical responses. People whose presence consistently produces a particular sensation in your body that you've been overriding with politeness or obligation. Your body has been tracking all of this. It's been keeping meticulous records. You just haven't been reading them. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that people describe when they've been chronically overriding their somatic signals. Not tiredness from doing too much. A deeper thing. The fatigue of being constantly at war with your own nervous system. Of spending enormous energy maintaining a conscious position that's in direct conflict with what your body is registering. When you stop fighting the signal and start reading it, that specific exhaustion begins to lift. Not because your life becomes easier, because you stop spending energy on a war that was never necessary. Your body is not your enemy, and it's not just your vehicle. It's the most honest informant you have access to. It doesn't flatter you. It doesn't protect your self-concept. It doesn't tell you what you want to hear. It just tells you what's true. The question is whether you've been listening. Chapter 7. The pause that changes everything. You don't lose control. You hand it over, voluntarily in a fraction of a second, without knowing you did it. That's the mechanics of emotional reactivity. Not a failure of willpower, not a character flaw. A transfer of agency that happens so fast it feels involuntary. Something happens. A signal fires. Your nervous system interprets it. And before your prefrontal cortex has had time to fully process the situation, a response is already underway. The words are leaving your mouth. The withdrawal is beginning. The door is being shut. And the part of you that would have chosen differently never got a vote. The gap between stimulus and response is where your entire emotional life is decided. Not in the big moments of conscious choice. Those are downstream. In the milliseconds before you knew you were choosing. Neuroscientist Benjamin Libetz's research on this is disquieting in the best possible way. Brain activity, preparing for a movement, begins measurably before the person consciously decides to move. Your nervous system is ahead of your awareness, which means the intervention point, if you want to change your responses, has to come earlier than you think. Not at the moment of action, before it, at the first sign of activation. This is what the pause actually is. Not a dramatic moment of deep breathing in the middle of a confrontation. Something more subtle and more fundamental. The trained ability to notice activation early enough that you still have options. Think of your nervous system as having 3 gears. In the first gear, you're regulated, present, flexible, able to think and connect. You can access your full range of capabilities here. In the second gear, you're activated, heart rate rising, attention narrowing, processing becoming faster but less nuanced. You're alert, You're not yet reactive. This is still workable. This is where intervention is possible. In third gear, you're flooded or frozen. Your prefrontal cortex has essentially been bypassed. Rational thought is severely compromised. Anything you do from here will require repair later. Most people's emotional regulation attempts happen in third gear. They're already in the flood. They're trying to apply skills to a nervous system that can no longer fully access those skills. It's like trying to steer a car that's already in a skid. The physics have changed. You needed to act before the skid began. The pause is about catching second gear, recognizing the shift from first to second before you hit third. And that recognition, every single time, is physical before it's emotional. A change in your breathing, an increase in muscle tension, a specific quality of heat or pressure. The body gives you the signal. The skill is learning to read it fast enough to use it. Once you've caught second gear, 3 things become possible that weren't possible in third. You can ask yourself what need of yours is currently being threatened, not to excuse your reaction, but to understand it. You can notice the story you're constructing about what's happening, because you are always constructing a story. And in second gear, you can still see it as a story rather than as reality. And you can ask what response would actually serve your goals here, not your immediate impulse, your actual goals. These aren't slow questions. With practice, they happen in seconds, but they require a nervous system that's still in workable territory. Which is why catching the activation early is the entire game. Here's the uncomfortable truth about people who seem emotionally controlled. Some of them aren't regulated. They're suppressed. These are completely different physiological states that can look identical from the outside. Regulation means the emotion is processed, felt, understood, responded to appropriately, and released. Suppression means the emotion is generated but blocked from expression. The physiological activation still happens. The cortisol still floods. The muscle tension still accumulates. It just doesn't show on the outside. Suppression feels like emotional control. It produces chronic physical tension, eventual outbursts that seem disproportionate, and a growing distance from your own emotional experience. It is not the goal. The goal is genuine regulation, the ability to feel fully while maintaining the capacity to respond rather than react. Physiological regulation is the foundation. Your breath is the one component of your autonomic nervous system you can consciously control, and that control has immediate, measurable effects on your nervous system's state. Extending the exhale activates the parasympathetic system, the brake on the stress response. An inhale for 4 counts, exhale for 6 to 8, sustained for 60 seconds, will produce a measurable shift in heart rate variability. This isn't relaxation advice. It's a technical intervention in your nervous system's current gear. Physical movement disperses the neurochemical activation that stress produces. When you're in second gear, moving your body, even briefly, helps metabolize the cortisol and adrenaline that are preparing you for a fight you don't actually need to have. A short walk, changing your physical position, deliberately relaxing the muscle groups where you hold tension. Cognitive regulation operates differently. It works through the interpretation layer. The same event can produce completely different emotional responses depending on the meaning assigned to it. This isn't positive thinking. It's recognizing that your interpretation is a choice, not always a conscious one, but one that can become conscious. When someone cancels plans, your automatic interpretation might be that you're being deprioritized. A different interpretation, that something came up for them that had nothing to do with you, is equally supported by the facts. The emotional response each interpretation produces is completely different. The skill is catching your automatic interpretation before it hardens into certainty. Behavioral regulation is the most underestimated of the three. Your body generates emotional states through posture, movement, and expression as much as it expresses them. Holding your body in a collapsed, contracted posture doesn't just reflect a deflated emotional state, it produces one. Deliberately changing your posture, your movement, your facial expression shifts the physiological conditions that emotions run on. This sounds almost too simple. It works anyway. Here's what mastery of the pause actually looks like in practice. It doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't look like someone visibly composing themselves. It looks like a person who seems unhurried, who responds to provocation with a quality of stillness that's different from coldness, who can sit with ambiguity without immediately reaching for resolution, who can be in a charged conversation without the charge running them. That unhurriedness is not a personality type. It's a trained nervous system. The pause isn't a technique you apply occasionally in difficult situations. It's a capacity you build through consistent practice in ordinary moments. Every time you notice activation early and choose to work with it rather than discharge it, you're strengthening a neural pathway. Every time you breathe through second gear instead of accelerating into third, you're training your nervous system to have more range. Over time, the window of workable territory expands. Third gear becomes harder to reach. Second gear becomes more familiar, more navigable. You spend more time in first, regulated, present, fully capable. That's not enlightenment. That's just a nervous system that's been educated. Chapter 8. Reading the room for real. Someone tells you they're fine. Every signal in their body says otherwise. Their breathing is slightly elevated. Their shoulders are carrying about 2 inches of extra tension. The usual ease in their speech has been replaced by something more careful, more deliberate. They're smiling. But the smile involves the mouth and skips the eyes entirely. They're fine. They said so. And every channel except their words is broadcasting something completely different. You notice this. Dimly. You file it under "something feels off," and then override it because you don't have language for what you're picking up. And they said they were fine. And who are you to argue with that? This is where most people's emotional reading stops. At the words. Because words are the only channel they've been taught to treat as legitimate data. Everything else, the body, the energy, the micro-expressions, the quality of someone's attention, gets filtered out as subjective, as projection, as noise. But it isn't noise. It's the signal. The words are frequently the least reliable thing in the room. Human communication evolved over hundreds of thousands of years before language became sophisticated. Most of the actual information about safety and threat, about social standing and intention, about emotional state and relational position, travels through channels that predate verbal language. Body posture, facial expression, vocal prosody, the rhythm, pace, and musicality of how someone speaks, independent of the words themselves. Proximity, eye contact patterns, the specific quality of someone's physical stillness or movement. These channels operate continuously. They're being broadcast, whether or not the person intends them. And they're being received by your nervous system, whether or not your conscious mind is paying attention. The gut feeling you have about someone within seconds of meeting them isn't magic. It's your brain rapidly processing information from these pre-linguistic channels and generating an assessment. The problem is that most people have learned to dismiss this assessment in favor of the explicit verbal content. They've been taught that the polite thing, the rational thing, is to take people at their word. And so the assessment gets filed under just a feeling, and the explicit content is treated as the truth, which means you're systematically ignoring your most accurate source of social information. Reading emotional signals accurately requires first establishing what researchers call a baseline. Every person has a characteristic way of moving, speaking, and holding themselves when they're in a neutral or comfortable state. Their specific default posture, their natural speaking pace, their habitual gestures, the way their face looks when nothing in particular is happening. Without a baseline, you can't read deviations, and deviations are where the information lives. Someone who normally speaks quickly suddenly choosing their words with unusual care. Someone who usually makes easy eye contact, suddenly finding reasons to look away. Someone whose energy is characteristically warm and expansive, becoming contained and careful. These shifts are meaningful, but you can only register them as shifts if you know what they're shifting from. This is why emotional reading improves dramatically in ongoing relationships. You have baseline data, and why it's harder with strangers. You're establishing baseline and reading deviations simultaneously, which is cognitively demanding. The error rate goes up, the projections increase. You're more likely to import your assumptions about people like them rather than reading this specific person accurately. The 7 universal micro-expressions: happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, disgust, and contempt appear and disappear from the face in under half a second. They're involuntary. They reveal the actual emotional state before the conscious presentation layer can cover it. Contempt in particular is worth knowing on sight. It's asymmetrical, one corner of the mouth tightening or pulling back slightly, while the other remains neutral. It's brief. And in relationship research, it's the single most predictive signal of long-term relational breakdown. Not anger, not conflict, contempt. Because contempt signals a loss of respect that anger doesn't necessarily involve. If you learn to read nothing else, read contempt, in yourself and in others. Vocal patterns carry as much emotional information as facial expressions, and they're easier to track in real time because you don't have to process them as fast. Stress reliably raises vocal pitch. Sadness lowers it and slows the pace. Anxiety produces what linguists call disfluency. More hesitations, more self-corrections, more filler sounds. Genuine enthusiasm produces more vocal variety, wider pitch range, more dynamic volume. When someone's voice goes flat in the middle of talking about something they're supposedly excited about, that flatness is information. Energy is the least scientifically precise of these channels, and also one of the most practically useful. Every person carries what you might call an energetic signature, a felt sense of their presence that your nervous system registers. Some people's energy becomes dense and heavy when they're emotionally low. Others become sharp and brittle when they're stressed. Still others scatter, their attention fragmenting, their energy pulling in multiple directions simultaneously. Your nervous system picks this up, not through some extrasensory mechanism, through the same mirror neuron system that allows you to physically feel something when you watch someone else experience it. You are genuinely wired to resonate with other people's states. The question is whether you've developed enough sensitivity to read that resonance accurately and enough boundary to use it as information without being consumed by it. Here's the piece that separates surface emotional reading from genuine depth. Most people read emotional signals and stop at the emotion itself. Someone's angry, someone's sad, someone's anxious. What emotionally sophisticated reading does is move one level deeper to what the emotion is revealing about that person's current needs, fears, and decision-making context. Anger almost always signals a perceived violation of something the person considers important. A boundary, a value, their sense of fairness or respect. Which means when someone is angry at you, the most effective response is rarely to address the anger directly. It's to identify and acknowledge the underlying violation. When you do that, when you name the thing beneath the anger before they've explicitly stated it, something shifts. The defensiveness softens. The temperature drops. Not because you've managed the emotion, but because you've addressed what created it. Anxiety signals uncertainty about capability or outcome, not weakness. Uncertainty, which means the anxiety response is looking for information or reassurance that closes the uncertainty gap. You can argue with someone's anxiety, point out its irrationality, tell them there's nothing to worry about. Or you can identify what specific uncertainty is driving it and provide something concrete that addresses it. One of those approaches works. Sadness signals loss or anticipated loss. It wants acknowledgement before anything else. Not solutions, not reframes, not silver linings. Acknowledgement that the loss is real and that it matters. People who try to fix sadness, to move through it quickly towards something more comfortable, usually extend it. People who can simply sit with it, acknowledge it fully, and not need it to be something else. They create the conditions under which sadness actually processes and moves. Understanding these emotional translations doesn't give you a formula. It gives you a map. And like any map, it's accurate enough to navigate by, while also being a simplification of something more complex than any map can fully represent. The goal of reading others emotionally isn't to know them better than they know themselves. It's to respond to what's actually happening, rather than what's being presented. To engage with the real person rather than the performance. To offer what's actually needed rather than what's conventionally expected. That gap between what's presented and what's real is where most people feel most alone. And your ability to bridge it is one of the most significant things you can offer another person. Chapter 9. How People Actually Decide. The most rational person you know makes every significant decision emotionally. The logic comes after. It's the justification, not the cause. This isn't a cynical observation. It's neuroscience. Antonio Damasio studied patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region where emotion and decision-making intersect. These patients retained full cognitive function. Their IQ was intact. Their reasoning was flawless. And they became completely unable to make decisions. Not bad decisions. Any decisions. Without the emotional signal telling them what mattered, the logical apparatus had nothing to work with. It could compare options endlessly. It couldn't choose between them. Emotion isn't the enemy of good decisions. It's the engine of all decisions. Logic is the vehicle. Emotion is the fuel. Understanding this changes everything about how you think about influence. Not manipulation. We'll get to the distinction. Genuine influence. The kind that creates outcomes that actually serve everyone involved. Because if you're trying to change someone's mind by giving them better information, you're working on the justification layer. And justification is almost never where resistance lives. Resistance lives in the emotional layer. Always. Someone is resistant to a proposal you're making. The explicit objection is logical. Cost, timing, risk. You respond with better data on cost, timing, and risk. The resistance remains. You add more data. The resistance firms up. This is a pattern most people have experienced and almost nobody has correctly diagnosed. The logical objection is real. It's also not the actual barrier. Underneath it is an emotional state: uncertainty, threat to autonomy, fear of being wrong, anxiety about change, that the logical objection is giving voice to without naming directly. Address the data all you want. Until you address the emotional state underneath, the data won't move anyone. This requires a fundamental reorientation in how you think about influence situations. Stop asking, "How do I make my case more compelling?" Start asking, "What emotional experience is this person having right now, and what do they actually need in order to feel safe enough to consider something new?" Safety is the operating word. People resist new ideas not because they're irrational, but because new ideas represent change, and change activates threat responses, and threat responses make the prefrontal cortex less available for genuine consideration. You're not dealing with someone who needs better arguments. You're dealing with a nervous system that needs to feel safer before it can actually think. The first move in any influence situation is therefore not to make your case. It's to reduce threat. And threat reduction is almost entirely an emotional operation. It starts with genuine acknowledgement, not strategic acknowledgement, the kind where you say, "I hear you," as a technique, before pivoting to your actual agenda. Actual acknowledgement. Demonstrating that you've understood the other person's perspective completely enough that they feel no need to defend it further. This is harder than it sounds, because genuine acknowledgement requires you to actually understand their position, including the emotional logic behind it. Not just the surface objection, the underlying concern that the objection is expressing. When someone feels genuinely understood, not agreed with, understood, their nervous system shifts, the threat response softens, the prefrontal cortex comes back online, and suddenly they're capable of actually considering what you're saying instead of just defending against it. Here's the part most people miss about emotional influence. The most powerful form of it isn't doing something to someone else. It's managing what you're doing to yourself. Your emotional state transmits continuously through your vocal prosody, your body language, your energy, your micro-expressions. Before you've said a single persuasive word, the person you're talking to has already received an enormous amount of information about your internal state. If you're anxious about the outcome, they feel the anxiety. If you're frustrated by the resistance, they feel the frustration. If you're genuinely curious about their perspective and confident in what you're offering, they feel that too. The most influential people in any room are not usually the ones speaking most. They're the ones whose internal state is most regulated, who project a quality of calm certainty that doesn't need the other person to agree in order to remain stable. That stability is contagious in the same way that anxiety is contagious. It creates conditions where the people around them can think more clearly, feel more at ease, and be more genuinely open. I've watched people walk into negotiations and lose them before saying a word, just from the quality of their internal state. And I've watched people change the entire emotional temperature of a room without raising their voice or making a single explicit argument. Your inner state is your first and most powerful influence tool. Everything else is secondary. Now, the distinction that matters. Ethical emotional influence versus manipulation. Because the skills are identical. The difference is entirely in intention and outcome. Manipulation uses emotional understanding to move people toward outcomes that serve your interests at their expense. It exploits vulnerabilities rather than addressing needs. It creates agreement through pressure rather than genuine persuasion. And it consistently produces one specific result over time: a degradation of trust that eventually collapses the relationship entirely. Ethical influence uses emotional understanding to help people make decisions that genuinely serve their own interests, which also happen to align with yours. It removes barriers to clear thinking rather than exploiting clouded thinking. It creates agreement through genuine alignment rather than through manufactured pressure. The diagnostic question is simple but requires honesty. Would this person, with full information and a fully regulated nervous system, make this same choice? If yes, if you're genuinely helping them get to a decision they'd freely make with clarity, that's influence. If no, if the agreement depends on their being emotionally compromised, uninformed, or pressured, that's manipulation. The feelings in the moment can be identical. The outcomes over time are completely different. Emotional calibration is the practical skill that sits underneath all effective influence. Different people have fundamentally different emotional decision-making styles. Some people make decisions by feeling into possibility. They respond to vision, to excitement, to the emotional experience of an imagined future. Others make decisions by eliminating threat. They need to feel that risks are understood and managed before they can move toward anything. Some people need to feel that a decision reflects their values. Others need to feel that it reflects their intelligence or capability. Reading someone's decision-making style correctly and calibrating your approach accordingly is not manipulation. It's communication competence. Presenting the same genuine proposal in a language that actually reaches the person you're talking to. A specific example: you're asking your manager to approve a new initiative. The manager is risk-averse. You've watched them consistently prioritize stability over innovation. If you walk in and lead with excitement about the possibility and the upside, you're speaking the wrong language. You're activating their threat response before you've established safety. The same proposal, framed through the lens of risk mitigation. What you've done to protect against failure, what the cost of inaction is, what safeguards exist, lands in completely different neurological territory. Same content, different emotional translation, completely different reception. This requires doing something that most people skip entirely. Before any significant influence situation, spend time genuinely thinking about the other person's perspective, not to find the right buttons to push, to actually understand what they're dealing with, what they're protecting, what success looks and feels like from where they stand. The more completely you can see the situation through their eyes, the more effectively you can communicate in terms that are genuinely meaningful to them. There's a paradox at the center of influence that the most effective people understand. The less you need to convince someone, the more convincing you are. When your internal state depends on the other person agreeing, when your stability is contingent on their yes, you transmit that need. And need is repellent. It creates distance, suspicion, resistance. When you're genuinely indifferent to the outcome, when you believe in what you're offering but have no emotional investment in whether this specific person chooses it, you transmit that too. And that quality of non-attachment is magnetic. It signals that what you're offering stands on its own, that you're not trying to fill something in yourself through their agreement. The most persuasive position you can occupy is genuine enthusiasm combined with complete willingness to hear no. That combination is rare enough that when people encounter it, they lower their guard almost immediately. Because they've never had to defend against someone who wasn't trying to take something from them. And in that lowered guard, genuine consideration becomes possible, which is all influence ever actually needs. Chapter 10. The ones who bounce the people who seem unshakable aren't feeling less. They're processing faster. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this book, because the story most people carry about resilience is that it's a product of not being too affected by things, of having a thicker skin, of caring less. And so they try to build resilience by becoming less sensitive, less open, less available to the full weight of experience, and they become, in the process, less alive, without becoming more resilient. Real resilience is not about the amplitude of the feeling. It's about the duration of the disruption. Resilient people feel things at full volume. They grieve genuinely. They get knocked down with the same force as everyone else. What's different is how quickly they return to functional equilibrium. Not because they cut the experience short, because they move through it rather than around it. The critical word is through. Most people's relationship with difficult emotions is avoidance with occasional breakthrough. They circle the painful thing, approach and retreat, keep themselves distracted enough that full contact never happens. And because full contact never happens, the emotion never fully completes. It stays in the system, unresolved, consuming background energy, lowering the threshold for future reactivity. The avoided emotion doesn't fade. It waits, and it charges interest. Here's the psychological mechanism. Emotions are functional states that evolved to drive behavior. Fear prepares you to flee or fight. Grief signals a need to withdraw and process loss. Anger signals a need to address a violation. Each emotion is oriented toward a specific action or adjustment. When that action or adjustment happens, when the emotion completes its function, it resolves. The system returns to baseline. When the emotion is suppressed or avoided, the cycle doesn't complete. The functional state persists below the surface, still pushing for resolution, still consuming resources. This is why people who never grieve properly stay fragile around loss indefinitely. Why people who suppress anger become chronically irritable. Why people who avoid anxiety become paradoxically more anxious over time. The emotion keeps pushing for completion. The suppression keeps blocking it. The pressure builds. Resilience is built by allowing completion, by learning to move through the full arc of an emotional experience rather than cutting it off at the moment it becomes uncomfortable. This doesn't mean wallowing. There's a difference between processing and ruminating that's worth being precise about. Processing moves through the emotion. You feel it, locate it in the body, allow its full intensity, find its meaning, and let it resolve. It has a trajectory. It goes somewhere. Rumination circles the emotion. You think about it, talk about it, replay it, analyze it, return to the beginning and repeat. It doesn't go anywhere. It creates the sensation of processing without the actual movement. The difference, physically, is whether the emotion is being felt or being thought about. Processing happens in the body. Rumination happens in the head. And the head, by itself, cannot resolve what the body is holding. Now, the concept that unlocks most of what people misunderstand about their own emotional suffering. The distinction between primary and secondary emotions. Your partner says something dismissive. The primary emotion, the direct, immediate response, might be hurt. That's real. That's data. It contains information about what you need in that relationship. If you feel it, acknowledge it, and let it inform your response, it will do its job and subside. But most people don't stay with the primary emotion long enough for that to happen. Within seconds, the secondary emotion activates. You feel guilty for being hurt, or ashamed that something that small affected you, or anxious about what the hurt means for the relationship's future, or angry at yourself for caring so much. These secondary emotions, your reaction to your reaction, pile on top of the original signal and bury it. And then you spend the next 3 hours managing the pile rather than addressing the thing underneath. Most emotional suffering is secondary. The original wound is real but survivable. The layers of self-judgment, catastrophizing, and emotional management that accumulate on top of it are what make it feel unsurvivable. Learning to stay with primary emotions, to feel them directly and completely without immediately generating secondary reactions, is one of the most powerful things you can do for your resilience. It requires a specific quality of self-compassion. Not the kind that says your feelings are always valid and justified. The kind that says feelings are allowed to exist without immediately needing to be evaluated, fixed, or explained. A feeling is allowed to be there. Full stop. The evaluation can come later. The second pillar of resilience is what you make difficulty mean. Not in a positive thinking way, not forcing reframes that don't fit reality. In a more precise way. Whether you interpret difficult experiences as evidence about your fixed limitations or as information about what needs to change. Two people face the same professional failure. One interprets it as confirmation that they're not capable enough. The other interprets it as data about a specific gap in their preparation or approach. Both interpretations feel emotionally real in the moment, but they produce completely different nervous system states and completely different subsequent behaviors. The first interpretation is a closed system. It confirms a fixed belief and produces withdrawal. The second is an open system. It generates a question and produces investigation. Resilient people are not optimists by temperament necessarily. They're open system thinkers. They've developed the habit, and it is a habit, not a personality trait, of responding to adversity with curiosity rather than conclusion. The third pillar is relational, and this is where the cultural story about resilience most dramatically fails people. The story says resilience is a solo project. You grit your teeth, you push through, you don't burden others, you handle it. The research says the opposite. The single strongest predictor of recovery speed from significant adversity is the quality of social support available and, crucially, the individual's willingness to actually use it. People who can ask for support, who can say specifically what they need and receive it without excessive guilt or minimization, recover from setbacks measurably faster than people who isolate. Not because the support makes the difficulty smaller, because the nervous system regulates more effectively in the presence of safe connection than it ever can in isolation. Your nervous system is a social organ. It was never designed to process extreme stress alone. Co-regulation, the phenomenon where one regulated nervous system helps stabilize another, is real and physiological, not just emotional. being in the presence of someone calm and genuinely supportive changes your neurochemistry. The cortisol drops. The heart rate variability improves. The prefrontal cortex comes back online. This requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust. Which is why the relational work, building the kind of relationships where you can actually be honest about struggling, is not separate from resilience building. It is resilience building. The fourth pillar is physical, and it's non-negotiable. Sleep is not a lifestyle preference. It's the primary mechanism by which your brain processes and consolidates emotional experience. During deep sleep, the brain replays and reprocesses emotional memories, gradually reducing their charge. Chronically poor sleep doesn't just make you tired. It progressively increases amygdala reactivity, narrows your emotional window of tolerance, and impairs the prefrontal cortex's ability to contextualize emotional experience. You become, neurologically, someone with diminished resilience, and no psychological skill compensates for this at the biological level. Exercise produces a similar effect through different mechanisms, dispersing stress neurochemicals, improving HRV, generating BDNF, which supports neural plasticity and emotional regulation capacity. These aren't supplements to resilience. They're its substrate. Resilient people don't experience less pain. They've stopped spending energy trying to avoid pain and redirected that energy toward building the actual capacity to move through it. That's the whole difference. And it turns out to be enormous. Chapter 11. What you do to the people you love. You open your mouth and your mother comes out, or your father, or whoever first showed you what emotional closeness looked and felt like. The words aren't the same, but the register, the emotional frequency, the underlying relational logic, is identical. And part of you hears it happening and can't stop it. This is not a metaphor. This is attachment theory translated into daily life. The emotional patterns you use to navigate your closest relationships were largely established before you had language sophisticated enough to question them. They were written into your nervous system through thousands of repetitions of early relational experience. And they run automatically, below conscious awareness, in every relationship that carries enough emotional weight to activate them. The strange and humbling truth is this: you don't bring your adult self into your most intimate relationships. You bring your adult self plus every earlier version of yourself that never fully got what it needed. And those earlier versions have opinions. They have reflexes. They have survival strategies that made complete sense once and make no sense now. And they operate most powerfully precisely when the relationship feels most important, when the stakes are highest, when the vulnerability is greatest, when you most need to be your current self and instead find yourself being someone considerably younger. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and extended by decades of subsequent research, describes the internal working models we develop for how relationships function. What to expect from closeness. Whether vulnerability is safe, whether other people can be relied upon, whether you are the kind of person who deserves reliable care. These models were built from the evidence of your earliest relationships, and they operate as the unconscious operating system beneath every significant relationship you've had since. There are 3 primary patterns, and most people can recognize themselves somewhere in what follows, even if the fit isn't exact. Secure attachment, developed when early caregivers were reliably present, responsive, and emotionally attuned. Produces adults who can form close relationships without excessive anxiety or avoidance. They can depend on others without losing themselves. They can be alone without feeling abandoned. They experience conflict as manageable rather than catastrophic. They're not without wounds or patterns, but their baseline relational expectation is that closeness is safe and that repair after rupture is possible. Anxious attachment, developed when caregiving was inconsistent, sometimes warm and sometimes withdrawn, unpredictably available, produces adults who are hypervigilant to signs of distance or disapproval in close relationships. Their nervous system learned that connection was possible but couldn't be counted on, so it developed a strategy of intense monitoring and protest behavior to keep others close. This looks like clinginess, jealousy, a need for frequent reassurance, or an intensity in relationships that drives away the very closeness it's trying to secure. Avoidant attachment, developed when emotional needs consistently went unmet or were met with discomfort, dismissal, or intrusion, produces adults who learned that needing others was unsafe. Their nervous system developed a strategy of self-sufficiency and emotional containment. This looks like difficulty with vulnerability, a tendency to withdraw when relationships become too close or too demanding, and a chronic low-grade discomfort with emotional intimacy that they often experience as preference for independence rather than as fear. Most people are a mixture, and most people have different attachment activations with different people and in different conditions. The pattern that's most activated is the one with the person who matters most. Here's what this means practically. When your partner is late without texting, and you feel a cold, spreading dread that seems wildly disproportionate to the situation, that's not about the lateness. That's an anxious attachment response, and it's pulling from a template that was written long before this relationship existed. When your partner reaches for closeness and something in you quietly closes, not from dislike, but from a reflex you can't fully explain, that's an avoidant response doing what it was trained to do. These patterns aren't character flaws. They're survival adaptations. They were intelligent responses to the relational environment that formed you. The problem is that you're running them on people and situations that are not that environment. You're solving for a problem that no longer exists, in a way that creates new problems you then have to solve. The most painful dynamic in relationships is the anxious-avoidant pairing. One person's anxiety activates the other's avoidance. The avoidance activates the anxiety. The anxiety intensifies the avoidance. It's a perfectly self-sustaining system of mutual distress, where both people are doing exactly what their nervous system trained them to do, and both are making it worse. Not from malice, from pattern. Seeing this clearly, really seeing it, requires a particular quality of honesty that most couples never reach, because it requires both people to stop arguing about the content of their conflicts and look at the structure underneath. The argument about the dishes is never about the dishes. The argument about time and attention is never just about scheduling. These are symptoms. The actual conversation about safety, about needs, about whether closeness is available and reliable, is the one happening underneath, without words, through the emotional logic of the interaction. Emotional responsibility in relationships means two specific things. First, taking ownership of the impact you have regardless of your intention. You might not have meant to communicate that you didn't care, but if the other person consistently receives that message from you, the intention doesn't cancel the impact. The impact is real, and it belongs to you to address. Second, it means becoming increasingly able to bring your current self, rather than your childhood self, into your most important relationships. Not perfectly, not all at once, but with increasing awareness of when the older pattern is running and increasing capacity to notice it before it fully deploys. This requires knowing your pattern well enough to recognize its early signals. For the anxious attachment pattern, the early signal is often a particular quality of scanning, a hypervigilance to the other person's emotional state, a rising need for contact or reassurance, a growing certainty that something is wrong. For the avoidant pattern, it's often a subtle internal withdrawal that begins before any conscious decision is made. A slight increase in distance, a decreasing availability, a need for more space that arrives as self-protection rather than choice. When you can name the pattern while it's beginning, rather than after it's completed, you have options, not unlimited options. The pattern still has momentum, but you can say, I notice something old is happening in me right now, and that noticing, shared with your partner or held privately, changes the quality of what happens next. The goal in relationship emotional intelligence is not to eliminate your attachment patterns. They're too deeply written for that. The goal is to develop enough awareness of them that they stop running silently, that you can see them, name them, and increasingly choose something different, or at least help your partner understand what's happening, rather than leaving them to navigate your pattern without a map. Secure functioning. The quality researchers describe in the healthiest relationships isn't produced by two people without wounds. It's produced by two people who are honest about their wounds and committed to not letting those wounds govern how they treat each other. That commitment is renewed daily, in small moments, in the choice to repair rather than withdraw, in the willingness to say what you actually need rather than performing the version of yourself that needs nothing, in the courage to stay present when every old reflex is telling you to leave, or to let someone close when every old reflex is telling you to hold them at a manageable distance. None of this is comfortable. All of it is worth it. Chapter 12. The Shadow Side. The most emotionally skilled person in the room is not always the safest one. That's worth sitting with, because the entire premise of developing emotional intelligence is that it makes you better, more effective, more connected, more genuinely helpful to the people around you. And it does. It also gives you tools that can be used in completely the opposite direction. And some people use them that way. Understanding this isn't cynicism, it's an essential competency. Because if you can't recognize when emotional intelligence is being deployed against you, you're vulnerable to it in ways that feel inexplicable. Because the person doing it seems so warm, so understanding, so attuned. The confusion that produces is a specific kind of disorienting. It makes you question your own perceptions. It makes you wonder if the problem is you. It usually isn't. The first thing to understand about manipulative emotional intelligence is that it doesn't announce itself. It presents as empathy, as attunement, as exceptional sensitivity to your needs and feelings. The person who uses emotional skill for manipulation is often the one who makes you feel most understood, most seen, most uniquely known. Because they are reading you accurately. That part is real. What's different is what they do with what they read. Authentic emotional attunement reads your emotional state and responds to your actual needs. It makes decisions based on what serves you and the relationship. Manipulative attunement reads your emotional state and responds strategically to your emotional vulnerabilities. It makes decisions based on what serves the reader. The experience from the inside can feel identical, especially in the early stages of a relationship, before the pattern of whose interests consistently prevail becomes visible. The diagnostic question isn't how the person makes you feel in any single interaction. It's what the pattern produces over time. Authentic emotional intelligence creates relationships where both people grow, where honesty is possible, where your sense of yourself expands. Manipulative emotional intelligence creates relationships where one person's needs are consistently prioritized, where your self-perception gradually shifts to accommodate their narrative, where you find yourself increasingly uncertain about your own perceptions and increasingly dependent on theirs. That gradual erosion of your own perceptual confidence is the signature. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens through a long series of small moments where your experience is reframed, minimized, or explained in ways that place the responsibility with you. You felt hurt, but they point out why your hurt was a misinterpretation. You raised a concern, but they reframe it as evidence of your insecurity. You noticed something that felt wrong, but their explanation was so smooth and their apparent hurt at being doubted so genuine that you ended up apologizing. Over time, you stop trusting your perceptions. You start running your observations through their interpretive framework before allowing yourself to act on them. You become, effectively, unable to read your own emotional data without their permission. That is the goal of this kind of manipulation, and it is accomplished entirely through emotional skill. Gaslighting, the systematic invalidation of another person's perception of reality, is emotional intelligence weaponized. It requires the ability to read someone's emotional state accurately enough to know exactly how to reframe it, to know which emotional buttons to press to produce doubt, guilt, or compliance, to deliver denial with enough warmth and apparent sincerity that the other person's nervous system registers safety even as their perceptions are being systematically dismantled. It's a sophisticated operation, and its sophistication is exactly what makes it hard to identify from inside it. Here's the protection. It isn't about becoming suspicious of everyone who's emotionally attuned. Most people who are emotionally skilled are using those skills genuinely. The protection is developing and maintaining trust in your own perceptions. Keeping that trust intact, regardless of pressure to abandon it. Your feelings are data, not always accurate, not always about what they appear to be about. We've covered that. But they are yours. They deserve to be investigated on their own terms before being explained away by someone else's interpretation. When you consistently feel confused, diminished, or at fault after interactions with a specific person, when you regularly leave conversations less certain about your own perceptions than when you entered, that pattern is information, not proof of anything specific, but information worth taking seriously rather than explaining away. The second dark pattern is emotional enabling, and it's worth examining because it comes from what feels like genuine care. The emotionally intelligent person who is always available to regulate others' distress, who swoops in before the difficult feeling can complete its natural arc, who makes the discomfort stop before it can teach anything. This looks like support. It produces dependency, because emotions that are consistently interrupted before completion never build the person's own capacity to move through them. The person learns, instead, that they need the enabler to feel okay, which serves the enabler's need to be needed while quietly preventing the other person from developing the very resilience they need. Look, I want to be careful here because the line between genuine support and enabling is real and context-dependent and genuinely difficult to navigate. The distinction isn't in the action. It's in the timing and the intention. Genuine support meets someone in their difficulty and stays with them through it. Enabling removes the difficulty before it can complete. One produces growth, the other produces gratitude and continued fragility. The third pattern is what happens when someone develops emotional intelligence specifically for performance, rather than genuine connection. They learn to present as emotionally attuned because they've discovered it produces positive responses. They mirror emotional states accurately because it creates rapport. They say the right things at the right emotional moments because they've learned that this is what generates trust. But it's a performance without an interior. And over time, not immediately, but over time, a performance without interior produces a specific feeling in the people around it. The feeling of being known but not reached, of being seen on the surface but not encountered beneath it, of having had 100 good conversations with someone and somehow feeling lonelier than before. If you're developing your own emotional intelligence and you want to ensure you're moving toward genuine depth rather than sophisticated performance, here is the check. Does your emotional attunement extend to situations where it costs you something? Can you acknowledge your own emotional mistakes with the same ease you identify others? Do you stay curious about someone when their emotional state is inconvenient for you? Do you provide support when there's nothing in it for you? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're actual diagnostics. Genuine emotional intelligence is functional in all directions, including uncomfortable ones. Performed emotional intelligence tends to disappear precisely when it would cost the performer something to provide it. Understanding the shadow side doesn't mean armoring yourself against emotional connection. Armor prevents the manipulation and also prevents the real thing. What it means is maintaining a clear, grounded relationship with your own perceptions. Trusting what you feel even when someone is offering you a more comfortable interpretation. Noticing patterns over time rather than evaluating moments in isolation. And knowing that the measure of someone's emotional intelligence isn't how well they read the room. It's what they do with what they read. Chapter 13. The quiet signal. You're in a conversation that's going well by every measurable standard. The words are right. The rapport is there. And somewhere underneath all of it, something is telling you this isn't quite what it appears to be. You can't source it. You can't point to a specific signal. It's more like a frequency your nervous system is receiving that your conscious mind hasn't decoded yet. And you do what most people do with that frequency. You override it. You tell yourself you're being paranoid. You focus on the explicit content, which is fine, and you let the subtle signal dissolve unexamined. 3 weeks later, you find out the conversation wasn't what it appeared to be. And you remember. You knew. Something in you knew before you had any conscious basis for knowing. This is emotional intuition, not mysticism, not a sixth sense. A form of information processing that operates faster and more comprehensively than conscious analysis. Drawing on data sources your deliberate attention doesn't have time to fully process. Your brain is running a continuous background program, scanning facial micro-expressions, tracking vocal micro-variations, reading body language patterns, monitoring energy shifts, comparing current input against a vast library of relational templates. The output of that program is the feeling. The quiet signal. And most people have been trained to treat it as noise. The first thing to understand about emotional intuition is what it's actually made of. It's not perception beyond the ordinary senses. It's rapid integration of ordinary sensory data at a speed that bypasses conscious step-by-step processing. Psychologist Gary Klein spent years studying expert decision-makers, firefighters, military commanders, intensive care nurses, and found that experienced practitioners rarely made decisions through deliberate analysis in complex, fast-moving situations. They pattern matched. They recognized the situation type and accessed a response that had been refined through hundreds of similar experiences. The gut feeling was the output of deeply learned pattern recognition happening below the speed of conscious articulation. Emotional intuition works the same way. When you've had enough relational experience, paid close enough attention, and developed enough emotional literacy, your nervous system builds sophisticated templates for emotional dynamics, and when a current situation matches or violates one of those templates, the system flags it. Not with a detailed explanation, with a feeling. The feeling is the message. Your job is to learn to receive it accurately without either dismissing it or over-interpreting it. The central challenge in developing emotional intuition is the distinction between intuition and projection. Because both arrive as feelings, both feel like information about the other person or the situation, and one of them is actually about you. Projection is your own unresolved emotional material being cast outward. You see your own fear in someone else's neutrality. You interpret someone's self-containment as coldness, because self-containment in your experience has meant coldness. You read hostility into ambiguity because hostility in your history has been what ambiguity preceded. The feeling is real, but its source is internal, not external. It's telling you about your own templates, rather than about the actual person in front of you. Intuition carries a different phenomenological quality. It tends to be cooler, less personally charged. It arrives without the urgency that projection typically carries. Projection wants to be acted on immediately. It has an emotional heat to it. It produces the need to say something, do something, defend against something. Intuition is more like a quiet observation, a note taken. It doesn't demand immediate action. It asks to be held and watched. Here's the practical test. When you receive a strong gut feeling about a person or situation, ask yourself, does this feeling increase or decrease when I'm calm and regulated? Projection typically intensifies under emotional activation and softens under regulation. Genuine intuition tends to remain stable. It doesn't need your anxiety to sustain it. This distinction requires that you develop what might be called emotional neutrality. Not coldness, not detachment. A particular quality of internal stillness that allows you to perceive what's actually present rather than what your unresolved material is generating. It's the difference between looking through a clean window and looking through one that's been fogged by your own breath. The fogging is your unprocessed emotional history. The work of developing intuition is inseparable from the work of clearing the window, which means everything in the previous chapters feeds directly into this one. The emotional granularity that lets you name what you're feeling. The sourcing skills that let you distinguish present signal from past amplification. The body awareness that lets you read your nervous system's first responses. The shadow work that makes your unconscious material less likely to be invisibly projected. All of it converges here. Intuition is not a separate skill. It's what high emotional intelligence produces when it's been integrated. The second layer of developing emotional intuition is learning to read group dynamics, the emotional field that exists between people rather than within any single person. When you walk into a room where an argument has just ended, you feel it before anyone tells you. The air has a specific quality, the way people are positioned relative to each other, the small distances and angles, The quality of the silence or the particular way conversation is happening. Slightly too normal, slightly too deliberate. Your nervous system reads all of this in the first seconds and generates an assessment. Groups have emotional climates that operate independently of, and often contrary to, their explicit content. A team meeting might be ostensibly about project planning, while the actual emotional dynamic running underneath is about who's being heard and who isn't. About an unspoken conflict between two people that everyone is carefully navigating around. About an anxiety regarding a decision that nobody has named aloud. The explicit conversation is happening in one room. The real conversation is happening in another. And everything in the explicit room is being subtly shaped by what's happening in the other room. The decisions, the interpretations, the silences, the moments when something could have been said and wasn't. Reading group emotional climates requires stepping back from your participation in the explicit content and developing a simultaneous awareness of the implicit field. What emotions are present and not being named? Whose energy is contracted and whose is open? Where is the tension gathering? What is everyone carefully not looking at? This is observational capacity that most people never develop because it requires splitting attention in a way that takes practice. You're listening to the content of what's being said while simultaneously tracking the emotional undercurrent. You're participating in the explicit conversation while also witnessing it from a slight distance. The moment you develop this capacity, meetings become very different experiences. You stop being surprised by outcomes that were emotionally inevitable long before they became explicit. You start seeing what needs to be addressed before it becomes a problem. You develop the ability to intervene at the level of the emotional dynamic, to name something that's present but unspoken, and watch the entire quality of the interaction shift. Naming the unspoken is one of the most powerful things you can do in any group context. Not naming it dramatically, not announcing it as an insight, simply saying, quietly and without accusation, "I'm noticing a tension here that we might not be addressing directly," or, "It seems like there might be some uncertainty underneath this conversation that's worth making explicit." Or just, "What aren't we saying right now?" That question, asked from genuine curiosity rather than from an agenda, creates an opening. And through the opening, the actual conversation that needs to happen can begin. The third layer is emotional resonance as a deliberate tool rather than an accidental experience. Your nervous system naturally mirrors the states of people around you through the mirror neuron system. Most people experience this passively. They absorb what's around them, and their state changes accordingly, without awareness or choice. Deliberate use of emotional resonance means allowing yourself to temporarily and consciously attune to another person's emotional state, to let your nervous system genuinely echo what theirs is experiencing, while maintaining enough of your own center to observe what you're receiving rather than being swept into it. This requires what you might think of as permeable boundaries, not walls. Walls prevent resonance entirely. Not no boundaries. That produces merger, where you lose track of where your experience ends and theirs begins. Permeable boundaries allow information in while maintaining the observer who can make sense of it. The practice is to consciously open your attention to the other person, their body, their breathing, their energy, and notice what arises in your own body in response. A heaviness might mean they're carrying something unspoken. A tightness might mean they're more anxious than they're showing. A specific quality of flatness in your own energy might mirror a depression they haven't named. You're using yourself as an instrument. The instrument has to be kept clean, well-rested, regulated, self-aware, to produce accurate readings. Advanced practitioners of this describe it as a kind of listening that extends beyond the ears, a full-body attentiveness that receives information from multiple channels simultaneously and integrates it into a felt sense of what's actually present. It sounds rarefied. With practice, it becomes ordinary. It becomes the natural texture of paying genuine attention to another person. The final layer is temporal. Emotional intuition, at its most developed, doesn't just read what's present. It reads where things are heading. This isn't prediction in any mystical sense. It's pattern recognition extended across time. When you've paid close attention to enough emotional dynamics, you begin to recognize trajectories. The specific way a relationship's emotional climate tends to develop when certain patterns are operating. The characteristic arc that a particular kind of conflict follows. The early signals of an emotional dynamic that, if unaddressed, reliably produces a specific kind of rupture. This temporal reading gives you the possibility of intervening upstream, before the rupture, before the dynamic has fully consolidated, when the emotional pattern is still malleable and a relatively small input can redirect its trajectory. Most people intervene downstream, after the dynamic has fully played out, after the damage is done, in the debris of something that could have been addressed much earlier. Emotional intuition, developed to its full depth, moves your intervention point progressively earlier. You stop reacting to emotional crises and start noticing the conditions that produce them before they arrive. That isn't clairvoyance. It's attention, sustained over time, with genuine commitment to seeing what's actually there, rather than what's more comfortable to see. The quiet signal is always broadcasting. The question is whether you've developed enough stillness and skill to receive it. Conclusion. You're in the middle of a conversation. Someone is talking, you're nodding, and this time, just for a moment, you notice what you actually feel. Not perfectly, not with complete clarity. Maybe it's just the faint awareness of something moving underneath the surface. A slight tightening, a warmth, a quiet recognition that something in this moment matters to you in a way you couldn't have named 6 months ago. But you notice it. And the noticing is everything. Because the noticing is the difference between living your emotional life and being lived by it. That's what this entire journey has been about. Not the elimination of difficult emotions, not the achievement of permanent equanimity, not becoming the most self-aware person in every room. Just this: the capacity to be present to your own experience with enough honesty and enough skill that you stop being a stranger to yourself. You will still get triggered. The patterns you've carried for decades don't dissolve because you've learned to name them. You will still sometimes hand over control in a fraction of a second and only realize it afterward. You will still find yourself in familiar emotional territory, wondering how you got back here again. This is not failure. This is the condition of being human, navigated with increasing skill rather than increasing shame. The difference between where you started and where consistent practice takes you is not the absence of these experiences. It's what you do in the moment after you recognize them. The pause that gets a fraction longer. The curiosity that arrives a little faster than the defensiveness. The ability to say, to yourself or to someone else, I notice what's happening in me right now, which is something you could not have said before you had the language and the courage to look. Here's what I know about the people who actually do this work, who don't just read about it and feel temporarily inspired, but build it into the texture of their daily lives. They don't become calmer in a flat, distant way. They become more alive, more available to the full range of what their lives contain, more genuinely present in their relationships, more capable of the kind of honesty that creates real intimacy rather than the performance of it. They become, in the most unadorned sense of the word, more themselves. Not the defended self, not the self that was assembled in response to early conditions that no longer apply. The self that exists underneath all of that, curious, responsive, capable of genuine connection, capable of genuine solitude, capable of sitting with difficulty without being destroyed by it. That self was always there. It was just waiting for you to stop running from it long enough to make its acquaintance. The conversation is still happening. Someone is still talking. You're still nodding. And now you know what you feel. That's enough to begin. That's always been enough to begin.